What happens when the words meant for a dead man become the lifeline for a living one? In the frozen heart of 19th century America, a preacher's daughter wrote letters to a soldier she'd never meet, pouring out truths she couldn't speak aloud. Miles away, a wealthy rancher intercepted every word, reading confessions never meant for his eyes. When fate brought them face to face, the revelation didn't just shatter her trust, it ignited a collision between two souls who'd spent their lives hiding behind silence. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The ink froze on the nib before Lydia Marin could finish the first sentence. She sat in the cramped corner of her father's study, the only room in the parsonage with a window that didn't rattle like bones in the January wind, and stared at the blank page before her. Outside, the Iowa prairie stretched white and merciless, a landscape that swallowed sound and returned only silence. The Charity Society had given her a name, Corporal James Ward, 5th Infantry Division. They'd given her instructions too: write cheerfully, write often, remind our brave soldiers that home remembers them. But Lydia Marion had never been good at cheerful. "You're still working on that?" Her sister Margaret appeared in the doorway, already buttoned into her wool coat, ready for the afternoon's charity meeting. Margaret had perfect posture, perfect penmanship, and a perfect talent for saying exactly what people wanted to hear. "It's just a letter, Lydia. Tell him you're proud of his service and ask about the weather." "The weather," Lydia repeated flatly. "Or his regiment. Or his hometown." Margaret adjusted her gloves with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Pemberton says her soldier writes back the loveliest descriptions of camp life. It's quite uplifting." Lydia suspected Mrs. Pemberton's soldier was either lying or delusional, but she kept that observation to herself. Margaret meant well. Everyone in the First Presbyterian Ladies' Auxiliary Society meant well. That was precisely the problem. "I'll manage," Lydia said. Margaret's expression flickered with something that might have been pity. "Mother says you're to come to tea service at 4. The Haversham boy will be there." "The Haversham boy is 43 years old and collects taxidermied squirrels. He has prospects." "He has squirrels, Margaret." Her sister's mouth thinned. "Not everyone can afford to be particular. You're 26, Lydia. That's old, I'm aware." Lydia turned back to her blank page. "I'll be at tea." Margaret lingered another moment, then swept out with a rustle of skirts and righteousness. The study fell quiet again, save for the tick of the mantel clock and the whisper of wind against glass. Lydia picked up her pen. "Dear Corporal Ward." She stopped, stared at the words. The Charity Society had been very specific about tone: optimistic, supportive, maternal, without being inappropriate. Letters were meant to boost morale, not burden soldiers with the troubles of home. Write about spring flowers and upcoming holidays. Include a pressed violet or a recipe for molasses cookies. Remind them what they're fighting for. But what if you weren't sure what anyone was fighting for? What if the whole enterprise felt like a performance, staged by people who'd never felt the particular loneliness of knowing your thoughts were too sharp, your questions too difficult, your presence too much? Lydia dipped her pen again. "Dear Corporal Ward, I've been asked to write you cheerful letters, but I'm afraid I'm not a very cheerful person. I could lie, tell you about church socials and spring planting and the things I'm told a soldier wants to hear from home. But that feels dishonest, and I suspect you've had enough of people lying to make themselves comfortable. The truth is this: I don't know you. You don't know me. Perhaps that makes this easier, or perhaps it makes it pointless. I'm not sure yet. Today is January 17th, and the cold is so bitter it feels like the landscape itself is angry. There are ruins outside town, the remains of an old trading post from before the territory was settled. My father says they're an eyesore and should be cleared away, but I visit them anyway. There's something honest about stones that have outlasted the people who placed them. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. I suppose I'm writing to you because the Charity Society insists someone must, and I drew your name from their basket, but also because there's a possibility, however small, that you might understand what it's like to be surrounded by people and still feel entirely alone. If you do write back, tell me something true. Not about the weather, not about morale. Something that matters. Yours in reluctant correspondence, Lydia Marin. She folded the letter before she could reconsider, sealed it with wax, and copied the address from the society's roster onto the envelope. It would go out with tomorrow's post, carried by rail and wagon to some distant military outpost she couldn't picture. Corporal Ward would probably never respond. Or worse, he'd write back with exactly the kind of platitudes she'd refused to offer. Reassurances that God had a plan and distance made the heart grow fonder, and other lies people told when they didn't know what else to say. But at least she'd been honest. The second letter came easier. 3 weeks passed with no response from Corporal Ward, which Lydia took as confirmation that honesty was indeed unwelcome. Margaret Soldier had already replied twice, sending a pressed wildflower and a description of a sunset that Margaret read aloud at dinner with tears in her eyes. Even Mrs. Pemberton's correspondence had yielded a recipe for hardtack that the auxiliary planned to replicate for the spring charity drive. Lydia's letter remained unanswered. Still, when February's bitter cold gave way to an even more bitter thaw, the kind that turned the roads to freezing mud and made every step outside an exercise in misery, she found herself back at her father's desk with another blank page. Dear Corporal Ward, I'm writing again, though I don't expect you'll answer. Perhaps my first letter offended you. Perhaps it never arrived. Perhaps you read it and decided quite reasonably that you have enough trouble without adding a stranger's melancholy to your load. But I've discovered something. Writing to someone who doesn't write back is oddly freeing. It's like speaking into a cave and hearing only echoes. The words exist, but they don't require anything of me afterward. Today I walked to the ruins again. The thaw has turned everything to mud except those old stones. They remain exactly as they were. Permanent. Indifferent. My father gave a sermon last Sunday about the importance of adaptability, of bending like reeds in the wind rather than breaking like rigid branches. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. But I kept thinking about those ruins, how they've stood for decades precisely because they refuse to bend. I wonder if we've been taught the wrong lessons about survival. My sister says I think too much. My mother says I should focus on practical matters, marriage, household management, the cultivation of pleasant conversation. They're probably right. A woman who spends her afternoons talking to stones and writing letters to silent soldiers is probably not demonstrating sound judgment. But here I am anyway, writing to you. Perhaps that makes us both fools. You for being wherever you are, me for believing these words might reach you. Tell me, Corporal Ward, what do you do when you're supposed to be grateful for a life that fits you like borrowed shoes? Still yours, in unlikely correspondence, Lydia Marin. She sent that letter too. And the next one, written in March when the Charity Society held a spring luncheon and Lydia spent 2 hours listening to women discuss the proper depth of a pie crust while pretending their opinions mattered. Dear Corporal Ward, I attended a luncheon today where 16 women debated whether apples should be sliced thin or chunked for pie filling. 16 women. 2 hours. I sat there thinking about all the things we don't discuss. Loneliness, disappointment, the specific terror of waking up and realizing your life has narrowed to a series of small, acceptable choices. No one at that luncheon was unhappy, or if they were, they'd learned to hide it beneath recipes and embroidery patterns and discussions of whose garden looked most promising. I don't know if soldiers think about such things. Perhaps when you're cold and hungry and far from home, the idea of women arguing over pie crust seems like paradise. Perhaps you'd trade every real conversation for the chance to be bored at a church luncheon. Or perhaps you understand exactly what I mean, that a person can be surrounded by community and still feel like they're shouting into wind. The ruins are still there. I visit them more often now. There's a particular stone near the eastern wall where I sit and read. No one from town goes there. They say it's bad luck or pointless or both. But it's the only place I feel like I can breathe without someone monitoring the depth. Are you somewhere you can breathe, Corporal Ward? Or are you holding your breath too, waiting for permission to be fully yourself? Write back if you want. Or don't. Either way, I'll keep sending these letters. At least until someone tells me to stop. Yours in persistent foolishness, Lydia. The letters became a rhythm. Every 2 weeks, sometimes more often if the isolation pressed too hard, Lydia would sit at her father's desk and pour out thoughts she'd never speak aloud. She wrote about books, the ones she borrowed from the traveling library, and the ones she bought with money saved from mending work. She wrote about her father's sermons, analyzing them with the same critical eye she'd apply to any text, noting contradictions and convenient omissions. She wrote about her mother's quiet disappointment, about Margaret's impending engagement to a banker's son, about the particular loneliness of being the daughter who didn't quite fit the mold but couldn't quite break it either, and she wrote about the ruins. "They've become my confessional," she admitted in an April letter, "the place where I can be exactly as strange and difficult as I am. Last week I brought a volume of Emerson and read aloud to the Stones. They were an excellent audience, attentive, non-judgmental, utterly unmoved by transcendentalist philosophy. I think you'd like it there, Corporal Ward. If you're ever in Iowa, I'll show you. We can both be strange together." She never expected a response. The silence from Corporal Ward had become its own kind of answer, permission to speak without consequence, to exist without judgment. In a life constrained by expectations and propriety, these one-sided letters became her single act of rebellion. What Lydia didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that every letter found its mark, just not the mark she intended. 400 miles west, in the grassland territory that would someday be called Montana, a man named Wyatt Callahan sat in his study reading words that had been meant for a dead soldier. The first letter had arrived in February, forwarded through a confused postal system that still listed his ranch's address under its previous designation as a military outpost. The estate had been a cavalry station during the territorial conflicts of the 1850s, decommissioned and sold when the Army moved its operations south. Wyatt's father had purchased it for practically nothing, built it into a cattle empire, then died and left the whole enterprise to his only son. That son now controlled 15,000 acres, employed 40 men, and maintained business relationships with banks in 3 territories. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and so wealthy that his opinions carried weight in territorial politics, whether he wanted them to or not. He was also, by most definitions, completely alone. The letter had come with a bundle of other mail, contracts, invoices, a notice about grazing rights. His foreman had brought it to the main house without ceremony, dropping it on Wyatt's desk alongside everything else that required his attention. "Dear Corporal Ward," it began. Wyatt had nearly thrown it out. Some mistake, some misdirection of military correspondence. He'd started to set it aside when the second paragraph caught his eye. "I could lie, tell you about church socials and spring planting and the things I'm told a soldier wants to hear from home. But that feels dishonest, and I suspect you've had enough of people lying to make themselves comfortable." He'd read it through, then read it again. No one, in Wyatt's experience, spoke like this. Not in letters, not in business, not in the careful social dance of territorial society, where everyone smiled and agreed and kept their actual thoughts locked safely away. This woman, this Lydia Marin, wrote like someone who'd stopped pretending. He should have returned the letter, should have sent a note explaining the error, redirecting her to the proper military channels. Instead, he'd kept it. And when the second letter arrived 3 weeks later, he'd kept that too. Writing to someone who doesn't write back is oddly freeing, she'd observed. It's like speaking into a cave and hearing only echoes. Wyatt understood caves. He'd built one around himself, not from stone, but from money and land and the careful maintenance of distance. After his father died, after the business threatened to collapse, after he'd spent 3 years dragging the ranch back from ruin, he'd learned that isolation was easier than intimacy. Safer. Less likely to end in betrayal or disappointment, or the particular agony of letting someone close enough to see how much effort it took to keep everything from falling apart. He employed men, conducted business, maintained necessary relationships. But friendship? Connection? The kind of honesty Lydia Marin poured into her letters? That had died with his father. Or so he'd thought. The third letter arrived in March, and Wyatt found himself waiting for the post with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was curiosity. An interesting diversion, the literary equivalent of watching a bird build a nest. Fascinating, but ultimately inconsequential to his own life. A woman who spends her afternoons talking to stones and writing letters to silent soldiers is probably not demonstrating sound judgment, Lydia had written. Wyatt had laughed, actually laughed, alone in his study. When was the last time anything had made him laugh? He began organizing his schedule around the mail delivery, would stop whatever he was doing when his foreman brought the post, sorting through it with carefully maintained indifference until he found the envelope with Lydia's distinctive handwriting. She wrote about her sister's luncheons and her father's sermons and the ruins outside her town. She wrote about books, Emerson, Thoreau, writers Wyatt kept in his own library, but had never discussed with another living soul. She wrote about loneliness with a precision that made his chest ache. What do you do when you're supposed to be grateful for a life that fits you like borrowed shoes? He'd sat with that question for an hour, staring at words that described his existence with uncomfortable accuracy. The ranch was successful. He was respected, if not exactly liked. By all reasonable measures, he should be satisfied. But borrowed shoes were still borrowed, no matter how expensive the leather. The April letter mentioned the ruins again, her private sanctuary, the place where she could be strange without judgment. Wyatt found himself envying those stones, those silent witnesses to her honesty. I think you'd like it there, Corporal Ward. If you're ever in Iowa, I'll show you. We can both be strange together. He traced those words with his finger, this casual invitation extended to a dead man by a woman who had no idea her letters were landing in the hands of a Montana rancher who'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly known. It was wrong to keep reading, wrong to maintain this fiction. Every letter that arrived was a violation of her privacy, her trust, her assumption that these words were going to a soldier who would either respond or disappear. But Wyatt couldn't stop. Because for the first time in years, maybe in his entire adult life, someone was speaking to him without pretense, without agenda, without the careful calculation that came with every interaction in his actual life. Yes, she thought she was writing to someone else. Yes, the intimacy was built on a lie, but the words were real. Her loneliness was real. And Wyatt's desperate need for this connection, however dishonest, was the realest thing he'd felt since his father's funeral. So he kept the letters, filed them in a locked drawer in his desk, organized by date, read them when business felt particularly suffocating, when the isolation of the ranch pressed too hard, when he needed to remember that somewhere out there, someone else understood what it meant to be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. The May letter arrived on a Thursday. Dear Corporal Ward, I've been thinking about silence, the different types, the different weights. There's the silence of being alone, which can be peaceful, the silence of being ignored, which is crushing, and then there's the silence of choosing not to speak, because the truth is too complicated or too raw or too likely to be misunderstood. I think you and I practice that third kind, me in these letters that I send without expecting response. You, in whatever circumstances, keep you from writing back. We're both choosing silence, but we're choosing it consciously. That feels different, somehow. More honest than pretending to connect. My father announced last week that we're relocating. He's been assigned to a new parish in the Montana Territory, a growing community that needs spiritual guidance, apparently. We leave in June. Wyatt's hand stilled on the page. Montana Territory. I don't know what to feel about this. Relief, perhaps, at leaving a place where I've never quite belonged. Anxiety about starting over somewhere even more remote. My sister is devastated. Her engagement will have to be postponed, possibly canceled. My mother is resigned, and I'm thinking about the ruins. About leaving the one place where I felt I could be myself, even if that self was alone with stones and wind. I asked my father where exactly we're relocating. He says it's near a town called Laurel Creek, in the cattle country south of Fort Benton. Do you know it? Have your travels taken you anywhere near such places? I imagine not. Soldiers go where they're ordered, and I doubt the Montana Territory ranks high on the Army's priority list. Still, it's strange to think I might be closer to wherever you are, geographically, if not actually. I'll keep writing, even from Montana. These letters have become my tether to something real. I hope, wherever you are, whatever you're facing, you have something similar. Some small act of honesty that reminds you who you are beneath all the roles you're required to play. With persistent hope, Lydia Wyatt set the letter down with hands that had begun to shake. Laurel Creek. Laurel Creek was 14 miles from his ranch. The woman whose honesty had become his lifeline, whose words he'd been stealing for months, was moving into his territory. Would be living close enough that he might see her on the street, might encounter her at a business meeting or social function, might have to look her in the eye, knowing he'd violated her privacy in the most intimate way possible. He should burn the letters, should send a confession or a redirection, or simply stop reading when the next one arrived. But even as the thought formed, Wyatt knew he wouldn't. Because Lydia Marin was coming to Montana, and for the first time in a decade, Wyatt Callahan felt something other than resignation about the future. He felt terrified. Set. The June letter arrived at the ranch before Lydia herself arrived in Laurel Creek. Dear Corporal Ward, this will be my last letter from Iowa. By the time you receive this, if you receive this, I'll already be on the train heading west. Everything I own fits into 2 trunks. Everything I was fits into even less. I visited the ruins one final time yesterday, sat on my usual stone and tried to memorize the way the light falls through the gaps in the walls. Tried to explain to those rocks why I was leaving, though of course they didn't care. They'll still be there long after I'm gone, permanent and indifferent as always. Margaret cried for 2 hours about leaving her fiancé. Mother packed in grim silence. Father made speeches about opportunity and new beginnings, and I felt nothing. Or not nothing, something too complicated to name. Like I'm shedding a skin that never quite fit, but I'm not sure what's underneath. I don't know what Montana will hold. Probably more of the same. Different location, same expectations. Different stones, same loneliness. But there's a part of me that hopes. What? That distance will change me? That new territory will somehow make me different enough to fit? Foolish, probably. I'll write again once we're settled. The address will change, but I hope the letters will still find you, wherever you are. Whatever you're facing. Thank you for being silent, Corporal Ward. Your silence has been the most honest conversation I've ever had. Yours across the distance, Lydia Marin Wyatt read that letter 7 times. Then he locked it away with all the others, walked out to the eastern pasture where his foreman was managing a horse-breaking operation, and stood in the Montana wind trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do when Lydia Marin arrived in Laurel Creek and discovered that Corporal Ward was a fiction, and the man who'd been reading her soul was very much real. The train deposited the Marin family in Laurel Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late June, when the Montana sun hung white and merciless in a sky too big for Lydia's Iowa-trained eyes to comprehend. She stepped onto the platform with her 2 trunks and a growing sense that she'd made a terrible mistake in hoping geography might change anything fundamental about her life. The town was smaller than she'd expected, a main street of false-fronted buildings, a hotel that had seen better days, and enough dust to coat everything in a fine layer of grit within minutes of arrival. It's rustic, her mother said, which was charitable. It's primitive, Margaret corrected, which was accurate. Their father stood surveying the town with the expression of a man determined to find divine purpose in desolation. It has potential. These frontier communities always do. They simply need proper guidance. Lydia said nothing. She was watching the way the mountains rose in the distance, jagged and indifferent, making the Iowa prairie seem tame by comparison. There was something brutal about this landscape, honest in its refusal to pretend it cared whether humans survived or perished in its vastness. She thought she might like it here. The parsonage was a squat building next to a church that looked like it had been constructed by people who'd never seen a church before, but had heard them described once. Inside, everything smelled of pine and dust, and the particular loneliness of spaces that had been empty too long. "I'll make it a home," her mother announced with the determination of a woman who'd made homes in worse places. Margaret burst into tears. Lydia carried her trunks to the smallest bedroom, barely large enough for a bed and a writing desk, and felt something in her chest loosen. Small meant private. Small meant no one watching. Small meant she could breathe without someone monitoring the depth. She unpacked her books first, then her writing supplies. The rest could wait. That evening, while her mother organized the kitchen and her father met with the church elders, and Margaret mourned her abandoned engagement, Lydia sat at her new desk and began a letter. The words came slower than usual. Everything felt different here. The light, the air, even the silence had a different quality. But she wrote anyway, because the ritual mattered more than the content. She was halfway through describing the journey when someone knocked on the front door. Lydia set down her pen and went to answer it, expecting a neighbor with a welcoming basket or perhaps one of the church elders come to inspect the new preacher's family. Instead, she found a man in his 30s, tall and lean in the way of people who worked outdoors, wearing clothes that had cost real money but weren't meant for show. He had dark hair, darker eyes, and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Can I help you?" Lydia asked. "I'm looking for Reverend Marin." His voice was low, carefully neutral. "He's at the church, meeting with the elders." The man nodded, started to turn away, then seemed to reconsider. "You're his daughter." It wasn't a question, but Lydia answered anyway. "One of them, Lydia Marin. Wyatt Callahan." He didn't offer his hand, which Lydia appreciated. She'd never understood the custom of touching strangers as greeting. "I own the ranch north of town. Your father will be managing the church services there once a month." "Services at a ranch?" "My men, 40 of them, most without easy access to town. Your father agreed to bring services to them." Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to name. "I came to introduce myself. Welcome you to the territory." "That's kind of you." "It's practical." He said it without meanness, just fact. Frontier communities work when people know each other, fail when they don't. Lydia studied him more carefully. There was something familiar in his directness, his refusal to coat difficult truths in pleasantries. It reminded her of her own letters, the ones she sent to a silent soldier who probably thought her too honest for comfort. "Are you always this blunt, Mr. Callahan?" "Usually more so." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. "I'm trying to be polite. It doesn't come naturally. I appreciate the effort, and the honesty beneath it." He looked at her then, really looked, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. The attention made Lydia want to step back and lean forward simultaneously, an uncomfortable contradiction she didn't know how to navigate. "I should go," he said abruptly. "Tell your father I'll send someone next week to discuss the schedule." "I will." He nodded once, turned, and walked back to where a horse waited, a massive bay that looked as expensive as its owner's understated clothes. Wyatt Callahan mounted with easy grace and rode away without looking back, leaving Lydia standing in the doorway wondering why a wealthy rancher would personally welcome a preacher's family to town when he could have sent any one of his 40 employees. She returned to her letter, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to dark eyes and careful neutrality, and the odd sense that she'd just met someone who understood the effort required to maintain a presentable surface. Finally, she wrote, "Montana is strange. The landscape is brutal. The people are direct. I think I might survive here." She didn't mention Wyatt Callahan. There was nothing to mention, really, just a brief introduction, a business arrangement with her father. Certainly nothing that warranted inclusion in a letter to a soldier who never wrote back. But that night, lying in her narrow bed in her narrow room, Lydia found herself thinking about the way Callahan had said, "Polite doesn't come naturally," like he was confessing something true in the guise of small talk. She wondered what he'd be like if he stopped trying to be polite altogether. The thought should have troubled her. Instead, it followed her into sleep like a question she wasn't ready to answer. The next morning, Lydia discovered that Laurel Creek operated on different rules than Iowa. Back home, a preacher's daughter was expected to maintain a certain decorum, visible at church functions, helpful with charity work, but ultimately decorative. Here, everyone worked, even the supposedly delicate daughters of religious men. Her mother needed help establishing household routines. Margaret needed company in her grief. The church needed cleaning after months of minimal maintenance. By noon, Lydia had scrubbed floors, organized a pantry, and listened to Margaret cry about her abandoned fiancé for the 4th time that week. "You don't understand," Margaret said between sobs. "You've never been in love." Lydia didn't point out that Margaret had been engaged for 6 weeks before developing strong feelings. Instead, she made tea and waited for the storm to pass. It was nearly 2 o'clock when she finally escaped the parsonage, claiming a need for fresh air. Her mother gave her a suspicious look, but didn't stop her. In Iowa, wandering alone would have caused scandal. Here, apparently, people had more pressing concerns than one woman's afternoon walk. Lydia headed east, away from town, following a creek that cut through the grassland like a silver scar. The landscape here was different from Iowa's ruins. No ancient stones, no remnants of previous occupation. Just earth and sky, and the sense that human presence was temporary at best. She walked for nearly an hour before she found it. A rock formation rising from the prairie like a question mark, weathered and solitary. Not ruins exactly, but something equally honest. A place that existed without needing permission or purpose. Lydia sat on the sun-warmed stone and pulled out the small notebook she'd brought. Started writing, not a letter this time, just thoughts. Observations about the landscape, the light, the way Montana seemed to strip away everything unnecessary until only truth remained. She was so absorbed in writing that she didn't hear the horse approach until it was nearly upon her. Lydia looked up to find Wyatt Callahan sitting astride the same bay from yesterday, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Miss Marin. Mr. Callahan. She closed her notebook, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how improper this would look to anyone from her old life. Are you following me? This is my land. Lydia glanced around at the unmarked prairie. All of it? 15,000 acres. You're currently sitting on the eastern boundary. He dismounted with that same easy grace, though he kept his distance. I was checking fence lines. Didn't expect to find anyone out here. Should I leave? He considered the question seriously, like it actually mattered what he thought. You like it here? I only just found it. But you like it? It wasn't really a question, but Lydia answered anyway. Yes, it's honest. Wyatt's expression shifted, something that might have been recognition or surprise or both. Honest, he repeated. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Rock and grass and sky. No performance required. He was quiet for a long moment, still watching her with that unsettling attention. Then, there are better spots on the property, if you want honest landscape. You're inviting me to trespass more thoroughly? I'm saying if you're going to trespass anyway, you might as well see the better views. He paused. Unless you prefer I formally ban you from the property. Would you? No. The word hung between them, simple and complicated simultaneously. Lydia found herself wanting to ask why he wouldn't ban her, why he'd sought her out yesterday, why he was still standing here when he clearly found social interaction uncomfortable. Instead, she said, I write out here. It helps me think. Write what? Letters, mostly. To a soldier I've never met. He never writes back, but I keep sending them anyway. She said it like a challenge, waiting for judgment or mockery, or the polite confusion most people offered when she admitted this particular strangeness. Wyatt's face went carefully blank. He stopped, started again. Why? Because I can be honest with someone who doesn't respond. No consequences, no disappointment. Lydia stood, brushing dust from her skirt. You probably think that's pathetic. No. The word came fast, almost sharp. No, I think it's... He paused, seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. Brave. Being honest without guarantee of reciprocation. That takes courage. Lydia stared at him. In 6 months of writing to Corporal Ward, no one, not her mother, not Margaret, not the Charity Society ladies, had called her brave. Strange, yes. Odd, certainly. But brave? You're the first person who's ever said that, she admitted. Then you've been talking to the wrong people. Something in her chest tightened. Wyatt Callahan stood there in the Montana afternoon, a man she'd met exactly once before, and somehow understood in 2 sentences what her entire family had failed to grasp in 26 years. I should get back, Lydia said, because the alternative was standing there saying things she wasn't ready to say to someone she didn't actually know. Of course. He moved to his horse, then paused with one hand on the saddle. Miss Marin, if you want to ride out here, you're welcome to it. I'll tell my men to leave this section alone. You don't have to. I know. He mounted smoothly. But I'm offering anyway. He rode away before she could respond, leaving Lydia alone with the stone and the sky and the uncomfortable realization that Wyatt Callahan had just given her exactly what she'd had in Iowa, a private place to be honest, without her having to ask for it. That evening, she started a new letter to Corporal Ward. I met someone today. Not someone important, just a rancher who owns the land I was walking on. But he said something that's been circling in my mind. That honesty without guarantee of reciprocation is brave. I've never thought of these letters as brave. Foolish, maybe. Self-indulgent, certainly. But brave. He's wrong, probably. Or being kind. But it made me wonder, what if the things we do to survive our loneliness aren't weaknesses? What if they're the bravest things we do? She sealed the letter and addressed it to the military outpost, the same as always. Posted it the next morning with the town's weekly mail. What Lydia didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her letters no longer went to any military outpost. The postal clerk in Laurel Creek, seeing the same name appearing week after week on expensive stationery addressed to a decommissioned army location, had quietly started redirecting them to the man who'd inherited that property. To Wyatt Callahan, who sat in his study that following Tuesday, reading about how he himself had made Lydia Marin feel brave, and wondered if there was a specific level of hell reserved for men who stole intimacy through lies. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm. Lydia wrote her letters, explored the prairie, and slowly built a life in Montana that felt marginally less suffocating than Iowa. Her father threw himself into ministry with characteristic intensity. Margaret mourned with decreasing conviction. Her mother organized the household with grim efficiency. And every few days, Lydia encountered Wyatt Callahan. Not deliberately, or so it seemed. He'd appear while she was walking, claiming to be checking fence lines or managing his men or conducting some other ranching business that happened to coincide with her afternoon explorations. They'd talk, brief conversations that felt longer than they were, about books or landscape or the particular challenges of Montana weather. He never mentioned her letters again. She never mentioned his comment about bravery. But the conversations began to feel like an extension of what she wrote to Corporal Ward, honest, unguarded, real in a way her other interactions weren't. "You read Emerson," Wyatt said one afternoon, when he'd found her sitting on a different rock formation with a book. "You say that like it surprises you. Most people out here consider reading a waste of time that could be spent working. Do you?" "No, but I'm not most people." He dismounted, which had become his habit during these encounters. Kept his distance, but stayed close enough to talk. "What do you think of him?" "Emerson? He's idealistic to the point of delusion, but occasionally he stumbles onto something true." Lydia closed the book. "Self-reliance sounds lovely until you're actually alone. Then it feels more like abandonment dressed up as philosophy." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't believe in self-reliance?" "I believe in it. I'm just not convinced it's virtuous." She met his eyes. "Sometimes relying on yourself is just what you do when everyone else has made it clear they can't be bothered." Something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe, or pain. "That's a dark view." "It's an honest one." "Not mutually exclusive," he said quietly. They fell silent. Lydia expected him to make excuses and leave, the way people usually did when conversation turned too real. Instead, Wyatt sat down on a nearby rock, not close, but closer than he'd been before. "My father died 3 years ago," he said, which was possibly the last thing Lydia expected to hear. "Left me the ranch, the business, 40 men depending on me for their livelihoods. Everyone told me how fortunate I was, how proud he'd be, how I'd honor his legacy. But he also left me a failing enterprise, debts I didn't know existed, and the expectation that I'd sacrifice everything to salvage his reputation." Wyatt picked up a stone, turned it over in his hands. "I did it. Spent 3 years doing nothing but work and obligation, and now I have exactly what everyone said I should want. Success, respect, security. And you're miserable," Lydia finished. He looked at her sharply. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Another long silence. Then Wyatt stood abruptly, dropping the stone. "I should get back. My foreman will be looking for me." "Of course." He mounted, started to ride away, then pulled the horse up short. "Miss Marin, the things you write to your soldier. The honesty. Don't stop doing that. How do you know I'm honest in my letters? Because you're honest about everything else. He touched his hat in something that might have been a farewell or an apology. It's rare. Don't let anyone convince you to stop. Then he was gone, and Lydia was left wondering how a man she'd known for less than a month could see her more clearly than people who'd known her all her life. That night she wrote to Corporal Ward about conversations that felt like recognition, about meeting someone who understood the weight of other people's expectations, about the strange intimacy of being seen. She didn't name Wyatt Callahan in the letter, but she thought about him while writing every word. The fourth week in July brought news that rattled through Laurel Creek like a physical force. The territorial governor would be visiting in August to discuss statehood preparations, and local leadership was expected to host appropriate events. Appropriate events meant social gatherings, which meant the preacher's family would be visible, which meant Lydia was about to be paraded through a series of functions designed to prove Montana had culture and refinement despite all evidence to the contrary. "You'll wear your blue dress," her mother announced at breakfast, "and you'll be pleasant." "I'm always pleasant. You're always polite. That's different." Her mother's expression softened slightly. "Lydia, I know this isn't what you would choose, but we're starting fresh here. Perhaps you could try to fit in better? Be more like Margaret? Be more open to possibility." The words stung more than Lydia expected. She'd spent 26 years being open to possibility, waiting for someone to see past her strangeness to whatever worthwhile thing might exist underneath. The fact that no one had wasn't from lack of trying. "I'll wear the blue dress," she said. "I'll be pleasant." Her mother nodded, recognizing a concession when she heard one. The first gathering was held at the home of Samuel Pritchard, Laurel Creek's wealthiest merchant and self-appointed social authority. His house was the largest in town, a sprawling structure that announced its owner's importance through sheer square footage. Lydia arrived with her family, wearing the blue dress and a fixed smile that hurt her face. Margaret had perked up at the prospect of social events, apparently deciding that if she couldn't have her Iowa banker, she might as well survey Montana's available prospects. Their mother moved through the crowd with practiced grace, making connections and establishing social standing. And Lydia stood near the refreshment table, counting the minutes until she could reasonably leave. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." She turned to find a man in his 40s, well-dressed and smiling with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed. "I'm sorry?" "I'm only observing. Thomas Garrett. I manage the bank." He offered his hand. "You're the new preacher's daughter." "Lydia Marin." She shook his hand briefly. "And you're correct. I would rather be anywhere else." Garrett laughed like she'd told a joke. "Refreshing honesty. Most people pretend to enjoy these things." "I'm not most people." "Clearly." He moved closer, which Lydia tolerated but didn't encourage. "I heard you've been exploring the territory, walking the prairie alone." "Is that scandalous?" "It's interesting. Women here usually stick closer to town." His smile widened. "Perhaps you'd like a proper guide sometime. I know the area well." Lydia recognized the offer for what it was, interest dressed up as courtesy. Thomas Garrett was handsome, successful, exactly the kind of man her mother would approve of, and Lydia felt absolutely nothing. "That's kind, but Garrett." They both turned. Wyatt Callahan stood a few feet away, and Lydia had never been so grateful to see anyone in her life. "Callahan?" Garrett's warmth cooled noticeably. "I didn't realize you attended social functions." "I don't, usually, but Pritchard insisted." Wyatt's gaze flicked to Lydia, then back to Garrett. "Miss Marin, I need to discuss something with you about the church services at the ranch." It was a transparent excuse. They'd never discussed church services, and any business would go through her father. But Lydia seized it anyway. "Of course, Mr. Callahan. Mr. Garrett, if you'll excuse me." She followed Wyatt through the crowd and out onto Pritchard's expansive porch. The July evening was warm, the sky that particular blue that only happened at altitude. "Thank you," Lydia said once they were alone. "For what?" "Rescuing me." "I thought you could handle Garrett yourself." "I could, but I didn't want to." She leaned against the porch railing. "You really don't attend social functions?" "No." "Then why are you here?" Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then, Pritchard made it clear my absence would be noted, interpreted as rudeness or arrogance or evidence that I don't value the community. Do you? Value the community? I value being left alone to run my ranch without social obligations. He stood beside her, careful not to touch. But apparently that's not how things work. Performance, Lydia said. We're all required to perform or face consequences. Yes. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. Inside, the party continued, laughter and conversation, and the careful dance of people establishing hierarchies. Garrett will ask about you, Wyatt said eventually. Let him. He's influential, well-connected, the kind of man families hope their daughters will notice. Lydia looked at him. Are you warning me about him or recommending him? Neither, just stating facts. Then here's another fact. I don't care if he's influential or well-connected. She searched for the right word. Performed. Everything about him is calculated to please. And that bothers you. Doesn't it bother you? Wyatt's mouth moved, almost a smile. Most people consider my lack of performance a character flaw. Most people are wrong. He turned to look at her fully then, and Lydia felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. They were standing close enough that she could see the flecks of lighter color in his dark eyes, close enough that moving 6 inches would constitute impropriety. Neither of them moved. I should get back inside, Wyatt said, but he didn't move. Should I? No, you should stay out here as long as you can stand it. He stepped back, putting proper distance between them. But I should make an appearance. Fulfill the minimum social requirement before I can leave with a clear conscience. Mr. Callahan, why did you really come tonight? He met her eyes, held them. Because Pritchard mentioned your family would be here, and I thought... He stopped, started again. I thought you might need someone who understands how exhausting it is to pretend. Then he walked back inside, leaving Lydia on the porch with her heart doing complicated things she had no business feeling for a man she barely knew. That night, she wrote the longest letter she'd ever sent to Corporal Ward, about expectations and performance and the exhausting work of being visible, about meeting someone who seemed to see past all of it to something true underneath, about wondering if honesty could exist between two people, or if it was always destined to be one-sided, words sent into silence, hoping for echo. She sealed the letter and set it on her desk to mail in the morning. Then she lay awake for hours, thinking about dark eyes and careful distance and the way Wyatt Callahan had shown up to a party he hated because he'd known she'd be there, and wondering what it meant that the only person who made her feel truly seen was someone who barely spoke and never touched and kept everyone at precisely calibrated distance, wondering if maybe that was exactly why she felt seen, because distance created safety and safety allowed truth. Wondering if she was falling in love with a man who would never let anyone close enough to love him back. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the most honest thing she'd acknowledged in years. August arrived with heat that shimmered off the prairie like something alive. Lydia had been in Montana for 2 months, and the rhythm of her days had settled into a pattern that felt almost sustainable. Mornings helping her mother, afternoons walking Wyatt's land with his unspoken permission, evenings writing letters to a soldier who remained stubbornly silent. Except the silence had started to feel different lately, less like speaking into a void and more like waiting for something she couldn't name. She was sitting on her usual rock formation, notebook open but empty, when Wyatt found her on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been appearing more frequently, 3 times a week now instead of once, and Lydia had stopped pretending these encounters were accidental. "You're not writing," he observed, dismounting. "No." "Writer's block?" "Something like that." She closed the notebook. "Or maybe I'm just tired of talking to myself." Wyatt settled onto his customary rock, maintaining the careful distance they always kept. 2 weeks had passed since Pritchard's party, since he'd admitted coming because he knew she'd be there, and neither of them had acknowledged it since. "Your soldier still hasn't written back," he said. It wasn't a question, but Lydia answered anyway. "No, he never has. I'm beginning to think he never existed at all." She meant it as a joke, But Wyatt's expression went carefully blank in that way she'd learned meant he was hiding something. Would it matter? He asked. If he never existed? I'm not sure. The letters have always been more for me than him. Lydia turned the notebook over in her hands. Does honesty count if the person receiving it isn't real? The honesty is real. That's what counts. You sound very certain. I am. He picked up a stone, that habit he had when conversations turned uncomfortable. I think honesty is rare enough that the direction it travels matters less than the fact that it exists at all. Lydia studied him. The way he wouldn't meet her eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he maintained even in casual conversation. Mr. Callahan, are you ever dishonest? Yes. The answer came fast enough to surprise her. She'd expected deflection, or that almost smile he used to avoid real answers. About what? Everything that matters. He was still turning the stone over, focused on it like it held answers. I tell people I'm fine when I'm not. I attend social functions I despise and pretend I value community. I let men work for me who think we're friends when I can't remember the last time I had an actual friend. He finally looked up. I'm dishonest about everything except the fact that I'm dishonest. That's the most honest thing I've ever heard you say. Don't sound so pleased about it. Why not? You just proved my entire theory about performance and pretense. Lydia leaned forward. We're all lying all the time just to survive being visible. That's a bleak worldview. It's true, though, isn't it? Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then, yes. For most people, most of the time, but not always. Name an exception. Your letters. To your soldier who doesn't exist. He held her gaze. Those are true. You don't perform in those. How would you know? The question hung between them. Wyatt's expression shifted, something that might have been panic or guilt or both. Because you told me, he said carefully. You said you write honestly to him because there are no consequences. I did say that. Lydia watched him closely. But that doesn't tell you whether I'm actually honest or just convinced myself I am. I know anyway. How? Because... He stopped, set down the stone. Because I can tell. The way you talk about those letters. The way you protect them. That's not performance. There was something in his voice that made Lydia's pulse quicken. An intensity that felt like confession or desire or something she didn't have words for. Mr. Callahan, I should go. He stood abruptly. I have a meeting with the Territorial Land Office. I just wanted to... He didn't finish the sentence, just mounted his horse and rode away like he was escaping something. Lydia sat alone in the afternoon heat trying to understand what had just happened. The conversation had felt different, charged, like they'd been talking about two things at once, the surface topic and something deeper that neither of them wanted to name. She opened her notebook and started writing, not a letter this time, but an attempt to capture the feeling, the way Wyatt had looked at her. The careful way he'd talked about honesty and dishonesty and letters to soldiers who might not exist. The way she'd felt like he was trying to tell her something without actually saying the words. 3 days later, her father announced that Wyatt had invited the family to visit the ranch. Not for church services, those wouldn't start until September, but for dinner. A social courtesy extended to the new preacher's family. It's quite an honor, her father said at breakfast. Mr. Callahan rarely entertains. His foreman says the last dinner party was before his father died. Then why invite us? Margaret asked. Professional courtesy, I imagine. And perhaps he's lonely. Her mother looked pointedly at Margaret. A wealthy, single man in his 30s? It wouldn't hurt to make a good impression. Lydia felt something cold settle in her stomach. Of course. Her mother saw Wyatt Callahan the way everyone else did. A prospect, a catch, a solution to the problem of unmarried daughters. I'm sure Mr. Callahan isn't interested in romantic entanglements, Lydia said carefully. How would you know? I've met him. He's... She searched for words that wouldn't reveal too much. Reserved, focused on his business. All the more reason he might appreciate the company of a suitable young woman. Her mother's gaze shifted between her daughters. Both of you will dress appropriately. This is an important connection for your father's work. The dinner was set for Saturday evening. Lydia spent the intervening days in a state of low-grade anxiety that she couldn't quite explain. She'd been to Wyatt's land dozens of times, had talked with him for hours over the past 2 months. But this felt different, formal, public, a performance instead of the honest conversations they'd built in private. Saturday arrived too quickly. Lydia dressed in her better gown, dark green, simple but well made, and tried to ignore Margaret's elaborate preparations or her mother's instructions about proper behavior. The ranch house sat on a rise overlooking a valley that stretched toward mountains in the distance. It was larger than Lydia had imagined, a two-story structure built from stone and timber, designed to last. Not ostentatious, but undeniably expensive. Wyatt met them at the door, dressed formally but still somehow restrained. He greeted her father with respect, her mother with courtesy, Margaret with polite distance. When he turned to Lydia, something flickered in his expression. "Miss Marin." "Mr. Callahan." "I hope you don't mind the informality. I don't entertain often." "We appreciate the invitation," her father said before Lydia could respond. Wyatt led them inside. The house was beautiful in an understated way. Dark wood, stone fireplaces, furniture that prioritized function over decoration. Books lined the walls of every room they passed. Real books, worn from actual reading, not the decorative volumes people displayed to appear cultured. Lydia found herself cataloging titles as they walked. Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, Darwin. The same writers she'd mentioned in her letters to Corporal Ward. The same writers she'd discussed with Wyatt during their afternoon conversations. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 20 but held only a table set for 5. The food was simple but excellent. Roast beef, fresh vegetables, bread that someone had clearly spent hours perfecting. Wyatt had hired a cook from back east, he explained. A woman whose husband had died and who'd needed work and a place to start over. "You seem to specialize in people starting over," Lydia observed. "It's a frontier territory. Everyone's starting over." He met her eyes across the table, some more successfully than others. The conversation flowed easily enough, her father asking about ranch operations, her mother making appropriate comments about the house, Margaret contributing occasional observations. Wyatt answered questions with his usual careful control, revealing nothing beyond surface information. But every so often, his gaze would drift to Lydia, and she'd feel that same charge from their last conversation, like they were speaking in code while everyone else heard only pleasantries. After dinner, Wyatt offered to show them the property. Her father declined, claiming fatigue from the week. Her mother insisted on staying inside to discuss household management with the cook, which left Wyatt standing in the doorway looking at Margaret and Lydia with obvious discomfort. "I'd love to see the grounds," Margaret said quickly. Lydia wanted to refuse, wanted to claim exhaustion or impropriety or any excuse that would let her avoid watching her sister perform charm while Wyatt maintained polite distance. But she couldn't, not without explaining why the prospect bothered her so much. The three of them walked out into the evening. The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and orange that seemed impossible. Wyatt led them past the main barn toward a fence line that overlooked the valley. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, which it was. "You must feel very fortunate to own all this." "Fortunate isn't the word I'd use," Wyatt replied. "What word would you use?" "Responsible. Burdened." He paused. "Alone." Margaret laughed like he'd made a joke. "Surely not alone. You have 40 men working for you, and you're clearly well connected in the territory." "That's not the same as not being alone." Something in his voice made Margaret falter. She glanced at Lydia as if looking for guidance, but Lydia was watching Wyatt, watching the way he stood apart even while standing with them, the way he looked at the landscape like it might offer escape from a conversation he couldn't exit politely. "Perhaps we should head back," Margaret suggested after an uncomfortable silence. "You go ahead," Lydia heard herself say. "I'd like to see more of the property, if that's acceptable." Wyatt's gaze snapped to her. "It's your choice." Margaret hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and self-preservation. Finally, "I'll tell Mother you'll return shortly." She walked back toward the house, leaving Lydia and Wyatt standing by the fence in the fading light. "Thank you," Wyatt said quietly once Margaret was out of earshot. "For what?" "For understanding that I couldn't—" He stopped. "Your sister is perfectly pleasant, but But she's performing, Lydia finished. Trying to be what she thinks you want. Yes. They stood in silence. Below them, the valley filled with shadow as the sun touched the mountains. Why did you really invite us here, Sai? Lydia asked. Your father wanted to discuss church services. You could have discussed that at the parsonage, or after church. She gestured at the house, the grounds, the elaborate dinner. This was something else. Wyatt was quiet for so long that Lydia thought he might not answer. Then, I wanted to see you somewhere other than isolated rock formations. Wanted to know if... He stopped again. If what? If the honesty we've built only works because it's private, hidden. He turned to look at her fully. Or if it could survive being visible. Lydia's breath caught. And? I don't know. You spent dinner being exactly as pleasant and appropriate as your mother wanted. Maybe that's who you really are. Maybe the woman I've been talking to on the prairie is the performance. The accusation stung because it was partially true. She had performed at dinner, had let her mother's expectations shape her responses, had been the dutiful daughter instead of the honest woman who wrote letters to soldiers and sat on rocks reading Emerson. You performed too, she said. Perfect host, gracious. Careful to give no offense. I know, I hate it. Then why do it? Because... Wyatt's hands gripped the fence rail. Because I don't know how to be both things. The man who runs this ranch and maintains appearances and fulfills obligations, and the man who wants to tell the truth. They can't exist in the same space. So we're both lying, Lydia said. Just in different directions. Yes. The word hung between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Lydia thought about her letters to Corporal Ward, about the honesty she'd poured into words sent to silence, about how much easier it was to be true when no one could respond, could judge, could ask her to be something different. I write to my soldier because he can't ask me to change, she said quietly. The silence gives me permission to be honest. Wyatt went very still. And if he wrote back, if he responded, then I'd have to decide if honesty matters enough to risk being seen. She met his eyes. I don't know if I'm that brave. You are. His voice was rough. You're the bravest person I've ever met. You barely know me. I know you better than you think. The statement should have sounded arrogant. Instead, it sounded like confession, like he was trying to tell her something without breaking whatever rules governed their careful distance. Mr. Callahan, Wyatt, please. He moved closer, just a step, but it felt monumental. When we're alone like this, could we stop performing, even just for a moment? Lydia's heart was doing complicated things. They were standing close enough now that she could see his pulse beating in his throat, could smell the soap and leather and something uniquely him. Wyatt, she said, testing the name, what are we doing? I don't know. His hand lifted, almost touched her face, then fell. I only know that talking to you is the only time I feel like myself, and I can't. The sound of footsteps on gravel made them both turn. Thomas Garrett was walking toward them from the direction of the main house, smiling with the confidence of someone who'd been invited. Callahan, he called. Your foreman said I'd find you out here. Wyatt's expression closed like a door slamming. Garrett, I wasn't expecting you. No? I thought your dinner invitation included the territory's key figures. Garrett's gaze slid to Lydia with obvious interest. Miss Marin, what a pleasant surprise. Mr. Garrett, I hope I'm not interrupting anything. We were just discussing the property, Wyatt said, his voice gone flat and formal. Miss Marin should return to her family. It's getting dark. The dismissal was obvious. Lydia felt it like a physical blow. The way Wyatt had shut down, put distance between them, retreated into the performance he hated. Of course, she said quietly. Thank you for the tour. She walked back toward the house alone, feeling Garrett's eyes on her back and Wyatt's absence like a wound. Behind her, she heard Garrett say something she couldn't make out, then Wyatt's low response. A business discussion, territory politics, all the things that mattered in his visible life. All the things that had nothing to do with the truth they'd almost spoken in the fading light. That night, Lydia wrote the angriest letter she'd ever sent to Corporal Ward. About men who said one thing and did another, about cowardice dressed up as propriety, about the exhausting impossibility of being seen when everyone, including her, was too afraid to stop performing. She sealed it with wax that felt like fury and addressed it with hands that shook. Posted it Sunday morning without rereading, without second-guessing, without caring whether some distant soldier judged her for having feelings she couldn't control. What Lydia didn't know was that the letter would arrive at Wyatt's ranch the following Tuesday, that he'd sit in his study with her words burning in his hands, reading about his own cowardice described with surgical precision by a woman who had no idea she was writing about him, that he'd finally understand the full weight of what he'd done, stealing intimacy through deception, building connection on a foundation of lies, that he'd spend 3 days deciding whether to confess or run, knowing either choice would destroy the only honest thing in his carefully controlled life. The week after the dinner passed in strained silence. Lydia didn't walk the prairie. Wyatt didn't appear. Margaret reported that several young men from town had expressed interest in calling, which their mother encouraged with transparent enthusiasm. Thomas Garrett specifically asked about you, Margaret said Wednesday evening. Mother thinks you should encourage him. Mother thinks many things. He's successful, respected, interested. Margaret paused. You could do worse. I could also do better. Could you? You're 26, Lydia. How many more opportunities do you think you'll have? The words stung because they were true. In their world, women had shelf lives. Lydia's was approaching expiration. Thomas Garrett represented security, respectability, escape from the diminishing prospects of aging spinsterhood, and she felt absolutely nothing for him. I'll think about it, she lied. Thursday brought a note delivered to the parsonage. Lydia recognized the handwriting immediately, strong, precise, unmistakably Wyatt's. It contained a single sentence. I need to speak with you, tomorrow afternoon, the eastern boundary. No signature, no explanation, just a summons that assumed she'd come. The presumption should have angered her. Instead, Lydia spent Thursday night unable to sleep, wondering what Wyatt wanted to say that required privacy and distance and the kind of urgency that bled through formal handwriting. Friday afternoon arrived too slowly and too quickly. Lydia told her mother she needed fresh air, ignored Margaret's knowing look, and walked toward the eastern boundary of Wyatt's property, with her heart trying to escape her chest. He was already there, standing beside his horse like he'd been waiting for hours. When he saw her, something in his expression cracked. Relief, or pain, or both. Thank you for coming, he said. Did I have a choice? Yes, you always have a choice. He looked terrible, exhausted in a way that went beyond simple tiredness. I needed to talk to you, away from, he gestured vaguely, everything else. What's wrong? Everything. He laughed, but it sounded broken. Lydia, I have to tell you something, and when I do, you're going to hate me. You should hate me, but I can't. I need you to know the truth. Fear flooded her system. What truth? Wyatt reached into his jacket and pulled out a bundle of papers tied with string. Even from a distance, Lydia recognized them. Her handwriting, her letters. Your soldier, Wyatt said quietly. Corporal Ward. He's dead. Has been for over 2 years. The world tilted. What? He died in a skirmish near the Kansas border. The military still has his name on file, but the address they use, it's my ranch, the old cavalry outpost. The postal system redirected your letters to me. Lydia's mind was trying to process information that didn't make sense. You've had my letters? Yes. All of them? Every single one. Since February. He held out the bundle like an offering or an execution. I read them. I know I shouldn't have. I knew it was wrong from the first one, but Lydia, you were the first honest voice I'd heard in years, and I couldn't stop. She stared at the letters. Months of private thoughts, intimate confessions, everything she'd written believing no one would ever read it except a distant soldier who would never respond. And Wyatt had read every word. You knew, she whispered, this whole time, every conversation we had. You knew what I'd written. Yes. About being lonely, about my family, about, her voice broke, everything. I'm sorry. The apology meant nothing. Lydia felt exposed in a way that went beyond simple embarrassment. He'd seen inside her head without permission, had known her thoughts while she'd known nothing about his deception, had used that knowledge in every conversation they'd had. The things you said, she continued, her voice shaking, about being brave, about honesty. You were talking about my letters you'd stolen. I didn't steal them. They were addressed to... Don't. The word came out sharp enough to stop him. Don't you dare justify this. You knew they weren't meant for you. You knew I thought I was writing to someone else, someone safe, someone who couldn't... She broke off, rage and humiliation warring in her throat. You violated every private thought I've had for months. I know. And you kept reading anyway. Yes? Why? The question was barely more than a whisper. Why would you do this? Wyatt's face looked carved from stone. Because I was drowning. Because your letters were the only real thing in my life. Because I'm a selfish bastard who couldn't let go of the first person who ever spoke to me like I mattered. His hands tightened on the bundle. Because I fell in love with the words you wrote, and then I met you and realized you were even more extraordinary than the letters suggested. Lydia couldn't breathe. You're... what? I'm in love with you. He said it like a confession of murder. I have been since May. Maybe longer. And I know that's wrong. No, I have no right to feel anything after what I've done, but you asked for truth. He stepped forward, still holding her letters. So here it is. I love you, and I hate myself for it. And I'm giving these back because they're yours, and I never should have kept them. He held out the bundle. Lydia didn't take it. She was trying to process too many things at once. The betrayal, the violation, the impossible declaration of love. Wyatt stood there offering her letters like returning stolen property could somehow make this right, like loving her excused reading her soul without permission. Get out, she heard herself say. Lydia, leave. Now. Her voice was shaking. Take those letters and leave. They're yours. You should have them. I don't want them. I don't want... The words caught. I trusted you. Out of everyone in this entire territory, you were the one person I thought I could be honest with. And it was all. You were using information you stole. Every conversation we had was built on lies. Not lies. I never lied to you. You lied by omission every single day. She was shouting now, not caring who might hear. You let me think my letters were going to a dead soldier. You let me write things I would never have written if I'd known you were reading them. I know, you're right. He looked desperate now. I couldn't tell you, because if I did, you'd stop writing. And I know how pathetic this sounds, but I needed those letters. They kept me, his voice cracked. They kept me human. Then you should have found a different way to stay human, one that didn't involve stealing someone's privacy. Wyatt's expression closed. He set the bundle of letters on the ground between them, like a white flag or a gravestone. You're right, he said quietly, about all of it. I violated your trust, used your words without permission, let you believe a lie because the truth was inconvenient. He stepped back. I'm sorry, that's inadequate, but it's true. I'm sorry. He turned toward his horse. Wait, Lydia said, and hated herself for saying it. Wyatt stopped, but didn't turn around. Why now? She asked. Why tell me now? Because Thomas Garrett is going to start courting you. Because your mother wants you to encourage him. Because if I didn't tell you the truth now, I'd have to watch you marry someone else while knowing I'd stolen the only honest thing either of us had. He looked back, and his face was devastation. I'm selfish enough to read your letters without permission, but I'm not selfish enough to keep lying while you build a life with someone else. Then he mounted and rode away, leaving Lydia standing alone with a bundle of her own words and the wreckage of the only relationship that had ever felt real. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just stood there as the sun moved across the sky, trying to understand how she could feel heartbroken and furious, and strangely understood all at the same time, trying to figure out if love built on stolen words could ever be anything other than betrayal, trying to decide if she was angrier at Wyatt for reading her letters or at herself for falling in love with him anyway. Lydia left the letters on the ground, walked away from them the same way she'd walked away from ruins in Iowa, from expectations that had never fit, from a version of herself that had been built on other people's assumptions. The bundle sat there in the Montana grass like evidence of a crime, and Lydia couldn't bring herself to touch them, couldn't reconcile the intimacy she'd felt writing those words with the violation of knowing Wyatt had read every one. She made it halfway back to town before the tears came. Not delicate tears that could be explained away as dust or wind, but the kind that came from somewhere deep and broken. She sat down on a fallen log and let them come, her whole body shaking with rage and grief, and the terrible weight of being seen without consent. The worst part, the part that made her want to scream, was that some small, traitorous corner of her heart understood why he'd done it. She'd felt the same desperate hunger for honesty, the same suffocating isolation. If their positions had been reversed, if she'd stumbled onto letters that raw and real, would she have been strong enough to return them unread? She wanted to believe she would have been, but Lydia had never been good at lying to herself. By the time she reached the parsonage, her face was composed. Her mother took one look at her and asked if she was feeling well. Lydia claimed a headache and retreated to her small room, where she sat at her desk staring at blank paper. For the first time in months, she had no one to write to. The realization hit harder than it should have. Corporal Ward had never existed, not really. He'd been a fiction even before Wyatt's deception, a convenient void into which she could pour thoughts too complicated for polite conversation. But the ritual had mattered. The act of writing had created a space where honesty was possible. Now even that was gone. Lydia pulled out fresh paper anyway, started writing without knowing where the words would go. I don't know who I'm writing to anymore. The soldier is dead. The rancher is a liar. And I'm sitting here trying to figure out if I'm angrier about the violation or the fact that being seen, really seen, felt like coming home. He read my words, every private thought, every moment of loneliness I wasn't supposed to admit, and instead of being horrified or dismissive or any of the things I feared, he understood. He saw exactly who I was and called it brave. How do I hate someone for that? How do I forgive them? She set down the pen. There were no answers on the page, just more questions. And for the first time since leaving Iowa, Lydia felt truly lost. Saturday morning brought Thomas Garrett to the parsonage with flowers and an invitation to attend a church social the following week. He was charming and appropriate and everything her mother wanted. Lydia accepted because refusing would require explanations she didn't have energy to give. You look tired, Garrett observed as they sat in the parlor under her mother's watchful eye. I haven't been sleeping well. The heat, I imagine. Montana summers take some adjustment. He smiled. Though I'm sure you'll adapt. You seem remarkably resilient. Lydia wondered what he'd think of her resilience if he knew she'd spent the previous evening crying over a man who'd violated her privacy. You're very kind. Not kind. Observant. He leaned forward slightly. I've been hoping to know you better, Miss Marin. You're not like other women in the territory. Is that a compliment? Very much so. Most women here are either completely conventional or desperately trying to prove they're not. You seem comfortable being exactly who you are. The irony was devastating. Lydia had spent 26 years being profoundly uncomfortable with who she was, had written months of letters trying to articulate that discomfort. And here was Thomas Garrett completely misreading her self-consciousness as confidence. I appreciate your good opinion, she managed. They talked for another 30 minutes, safe topics, pleasant exchanges, the kind of conversation that left no mark. When Garrett finally left, her mother practically glowed. He's clearly interested, she said, and you handled that beautifully. Did I? You were charming without being forward, interested without seeming desperate, exactly right. Her mother's expression softened. I know you've been unhappy, Lydia, but perhaps this is your chance for something different. Mr. Garrett is a good man. I'm sure he is. Then you'll encourage him? Lydia thought about Wyatt's face when he'd confessed, the devastation in his voice when he'd said he loved her, the bundle of letters he'd offered back like returning stolen goods. I don't know, she said honestly. Her mother's mouth thinned, but she didn't push. Margaret appeared in the doorway, having clearly been listening. What happened with Mr. Callahan? She asked once their mother left. You've been miserable since his dinner. Nothing happened. Lydia, I'm not blind. Something changed. You stopped walking. He stopped visiting. And now you're suddenly entertaining Thomas Garrett. Margaret sat beside her. What did he do? It's complicated. Try me. Lydia looked at her sister. Pretty, conventional Margaret, who'd never understood her but had never stopped trying. If someone violated your trust but did it because they were desperate for connection, would you forgive them? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I don't know. How badly did they violate it? Profoundly. And how desperate were they? Very. Then I suppose it depends on whether their desperation excuses the violation. Margaret took her hand. But Lydia, desperation explains things. It doesn't make them right. The words settled like stones. Desperation explains things. It doesn't make them right. That night Lydia dreamed about her letters burning, woke up gasping, the image so vivid she could smell smoke. She lit a candle and pulled out the one letter she'd written since the confrontation, the one addressed to no one. Then she wrote another. You said you fell in love with my words before you met me, but those words were written for someone else, a dead soldier who would never judge or respond or use them to build false intimacy. You stole that safety, turned private thoughts into relationship currency. And now you claim to love me. But how can I believe that when the version of me you know was never meant to be seen? I've spent my whole life being told I'm too much, too honest, too strange, too difficult. So I created a space where I could be all of those things without consequences. You took that space, occupied it without permission, and now I don't know if there's anywhere left where I can be myself without performance or violation or the constant fear of being seen wrong. You said my honesty was brave, but bravery requires choice. I didn't choose to be honest with you. You took that choice away. She sealed it without an address. There was nowhere to send it, no one to receive it. But the act of writing still mattered, even if the destination had disappeared. The next week passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Thomas Garrett called twice more. Lydia attended the church social and smiled until her face hurt. Her father prepared sermons. Her mother organized the household. Margaret had stopped crying about her abandoned engagement and started showing interest in the territorial surveyor, and Wyatt Callahan became invisible. His name appeared in conversation, business dealings, ranch operations, the upcoming territorial governor's visit. But he didn't attend church, didn't appear at social functions, didn't materialize on the prairie during Lydia's increasingly rare walks. She told herself she was relieved, told herself his absence made things easier. She was lying. Then on a Thursday afternoon in late August, Wyatt's foreman appeared at the parsonage asking for her father. They met in the study with the door closed. Lydia tried not to listen, but the walls were thin and the conversation was heated. Cannot simply refuse to host the governor, her father was saying. Mr. Callahan has his reasons. The foreman's voice was defensive. Personal matters that require his attention. Personal matters don't supersede civic duty. The territory expects, with respect, Reverend, Mr. Callahan doesn't give a damn what the territory expects. Silence. Then her father's measured response. Tell Mr. Callahan that if he refuses this obligation, there will be consequences. The territorial leadership doesn't take kindly to wealthy landowners who consider themselves above community responsibility. After the foreman left, Lydia found her father at his desk looking troubled. What's happening with Mr. Callahan? She asked. He's refusing to host the governor's visit to his ranch. It's been planned for weeks, a tour of successful territorial enterprises, meetings with local leadership. Callahan was supposed to showcase the cattle industry. Her father rubbed his temples. Now he's withdrawn completely, won't attend meetings, won't fulfill his commitments. Some are saying he's mentally unstable. Who's saying that? Thomas Garrett, primarily, and Samuel Pritchard. They're concerned about a man with Callahan's resources and influence becoming erratic. Lydia felt cold spread through her chest. Concerned or opportunistic? Her father looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Mr. Callahan owns significant land, controls water rights and grazing access. If he were deemed unfit, someone would have to manage those interests. She kept her voice level. I imagine men like Garrett and Pritchard would be very willing to shoulder that burden. That's a cynical interpretation. Is it wrong? Her father didn't answer, which was answer enough. That evening, Lydia walked to the rock formation on Wyatt's property, the one where they'd had their first real conversation. She didn't expect to find him there. Didn't expect to find anything except stones and sky and maybe some clarity. Instead, she found a letter. It sat on her usual rock, weighted down with a stone, her name written in Wyatt's precise handwriting. Lydia picked it up with shaking hands. Lydia, I know you told me to leave. I'm honoring that, but I need you to understand what's happening before you hear it from people who will use it against me. Thomas Garrett and several town leaders are moving to have me declared unfit to manage my father's estate. They're claiming my recent behavior, withdrawal from social obligations, refusal to host the governor, general reclusiveness, demonstrates mental instability. If they succeed, a territorial court will appoint someone to oversee my business interests. That someone will almost certainly be Garrett himself. They're not wrong that I've withdrawn. After our conversation, I couldn't stomach the performance anymore. Couldn't attend dinners and smile and pretend I wasn't dying inside. So I stopped pretending. Stopped attending. Stopped doing anything except managing the ranch and trying to figure out how to live with what I'd done to you. Apparently, isolation is evidence of insanity in territorial Montana, or convenient grounds for a land grab, depending on your perspective. I'm writing this because I need you to know I'm not crazy, I'm not unstable, I'm just tired of lying, about being fine, about valuing community, about wanting to maintain relationships with people I don't respect. You were right to be angry, right to feel violated, right to tell me to leave. I stole something precious from you, and no amount of desperation excuses that. But I won't let them steal what's mine. Not my land, not my father's legacy, not the one thing I actually earned through blood and work and years of sacrificing everything else. If you hear I've been declared unfit, know that it's not truth. It's power dressed up as concern. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know. Wyatt Lydia read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and walked toward town with purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. Thomas Garrett's office sat above the bank, accessible by an external staircase that announced the occupant's importance. Lydia climbed it without hesitation and knocked on the door marked Territorial Land Management. Miss Marin. Garrett stood when she entered, clearly pleased. What a delightful surprise. We need to talk about Wyatt Callahan. His expression shifted, still pleasant but more guarded. Ah, you've heard about the unfortunate situation. I've heard you're trying to seize his property under the guise of concern for his well-being. Garrett's smile didn't waver. That's a harsh characterization. Several community leaders have noticed Mr. Callahan's increasingly erratic behavior. We're simply exploring whether intervention might be necessary. Intervention or acquisition? I'm not sure I understand your meaning. Yes, you do. Lydia remained standing. Mr. Callahan controls water rights that benefit his ranch but limit expansion opportunities for others. His withdrawal from social obligations is convenient grounds for questioning his fitness, particularly if the person asking the question stands to benefit from his removal. You think very poorly of me, Miss Marin. I think realistically of you, Mr. Garrett. You're an intelligent businessman who sees an opportunity. But I'm asking you, as someone who has been kind to me, to consider what you're actually doing. Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying her. You care about Callahan. It wasn't a question, but Lydia answered anyway. I care about justice, about not allowing powerful men to destroy someone simply because it's profitable. Even if that someone has given you cause for anger, your family mentioned there was some unpleasantness after his dinner. So they'd been watching, cataloging Wyatt's social failures, building a case. Lydia felt fury rise like heat. Whatever happened between Mr. Callahan and myself is private. It doesn't make him unfit to manage his property. Perhaps not. But combined with everything else, the refusal to engage with community, the withdrawal from territorial obligations, the increasingly obvious signs of instability, it paints a concerning picture. Garrett's voice was reasonable, which made it worse. We have a responsibility to protect the territory's interests. You have a responsibility to your own interests. Let's at least be honest about that. Honesty. Garrett smiled. I appreciate your directness, Miss Marin. It's refreshing, but I'm afraid this matter is beyond personal feelings. The territorial court will make the final determination. When? The hearing is scheduled for next week. Mr. Callahan has been informed. If he chooses not to attend, that will only support our position. Lydia left before she said something she couldn't take back. Walked through town in the afternoon heat, mind racing. A hearing meant testimony, evidence, character witnesses. It meant Wyatt would have to defend himself publicly, explain his withdrawal, justify his isolation to men who'd already decided he was unfit. It meant performance. The exact thing he'd said he couldn't stomach anymore. She found herself at the parsonage without remembering the walk. Her father was in his study preparing Sunday's sermon. Lydia knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked up, startled. "Lydia?" "The hearing for Mr. Callahan. Will you be testifying?" "I've been asked to provide observations about his state of mind, yes." "And what will you say?" Her father set down his pen. "The truth, that he's been increasingly withdrawn, that he's refused to fulfill commitments, that his behavior suggests someone struggling with private difficulties." Difficulties or grief? I'm not sure there's a meaningful difference in this context. There's every difference. Lydia moved closer. "Father, Mr. Callahan lost his father 3 years ago, spent those years rebuilding a failing business while everyone watched and judged and expected him to perform gratitude for an inheritance that nearly destroyed him. He's tired, he's isolated. But that's not insanity, that's exhaustion. You seem very certain of his inner life." "I am." "Why?" The question hung between them. Lydia could lie, deflect, maintain the careful distance she'd always kept between her private thoughts and her family's scrutiny. But she was tired of performing too. "Because I understand him. Because we've talked about books and loneliness and the specific hell of being surrounded by people who expect you to be grateful for circumstances that suffocate you." She met her father's eyes. "Because he's one of the only people who's ever seen me clearly, and I refuse to let him be destroyed for the crime of being honest about his limitations." Her father studied her with an expression she couldn't read. "You care for him?" "Yes." "Even after the unpleasantness Margaret mentioned?" "Especially after it." Lydia's voice shook. "He violated my trust in a profound way, but he also saw me more clearly than anyone else ever has. And I'm still angry about the first part, but I can't pretend the second part doesn't matter. This hearing is serious, Lydia. If Callahan is deemed unfit, it will have significant consequences." "I know. That's why I'm asking you to testify truthfully, not about withdrawal as evidence of instability, but as evidence of someone who's finally stopped lying about being fine." Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You want me to defend him?" "I want you to see him, really see him, not just the behavior that makes community leaders uncomfortable." She paused. "You preach about grace and understanding. Here's your chance to practice it." That Sunday, Lydia walked to the old rock formation one last time. The letters were gone. Either Wyatt had retrieved them or the wind had scattered them across the prairie. Either way, they'd vanished like the fiction of Corporal Ward, leaving only truth behind. She sat on her usual stone and pulled out paper. Started writing without knowing if anyone would read it. "I don't know if you'll see this. Don't know if you come here anymore. But I needed to say things I can't say to your face. You were right that I'm angry. Furious, actually, at the violation. At the theft of privacy. At knowing you occupied space in my head without permission. But you were also right that honesty without reciprocation is brave. And maybe, reading someone's honesty and understanding it instead of judging it is brave too. I don't forgive you yet. I'm not sure I can. But I'm starting to understand the difference between betrayal and desperation, between using someone and being so starved for connection that you make terrible choices. The hearing is Tuesday. Thomas Garrett is building a case against you using your withdrawal as evidence. My father will testify, but I've asked him to tell the truth instead of just facts. I don't know if it will help, but I couldn't let them destroy you without trying. You said you fell in love with my words. Here are more words. You're not crazy for being exhausted. You're not unfit for refusing to perform. You're not broken for needing honesty more than you need approval. You're just human, flawed and desperate and terribly lonely. Like me. I don't know what happens next, between us or with the hearing or any of it. But I wanted you to know, I see you too. Even angry, even hurt, I see exactly who you are, and I'm not afraid of it. Lydia. She left it on the rock weighted down with a stone, like Wyatt had done with his letter. Walked back to town without looking back. Tuesday arrived with heat that promised storms. The territorial hearing was held in Laurel Creek's largest building, the meeting hall that served as courtroom, town gathering space, and occasional dance venue. By the time Lydia arrived with her family, it was already packed. Wyatt sat at a table facing the territorial judge, his lawyer beside him. He looked tired but composed, dressed formally but without ostentation. When he saw Lydia enter, something crossed his face too quick to name. Thomas Garrett sat with Samuel Pritchard and two other businessmen, their case already prepared. They'd brought witnesses, ranch hands who'd noticed Wyatt's increasing isolation, townspeople who'd been rebuffed when they'd tried to engage him socially, the church elder who'd arranged the governor's visit that Wyatt had refused. The judge, a severe man from the territorial capital, listened to their testimony with no visible reaction. Withdrawal from community, refusal of civic duty, erratic behavior suggesting mental instability. Then it was Wyatt's turn. His lawyer presented financial records showing the ranch's success, letters from business partners praising Wyatt's acumen and reliability, documentation of contracts fulfilled, and obligations met professionally even as personal interactions diminished. My client is guilty of being private, the lawyer argued, not of being unfit. Privacy and reclusiveness are different things, Garrett countered. Mr. Callahan has moved beyond preference for solitude into active withdrawal from society. That suggests someone struggling with difficulties they cannot manage. The judge looked at Wyatt. Do you wish to speak in your own defense? Wyatt stood slowly. Lydia watched him take in the crowd, the scrutiny, the performance required, saw him make a choice. Yes, Your Honor. Proceed. I've spent 3 years rebuilding my father's failing enterprise while maintaining the appearance that everything was fine. I attended social functions I found meaningless. Maintained relationships with people I didn't respect. Smiled and agreed and performed gratitude for circumstances that were slowly destroying me. His voice was level, controlled. Then I met someone who showed me what honesty looked like, who wrote about loneliness and isolation with a clarity that made me realize I'd been lying to myself for years. He glanced at Lydia. She felt the attention like heat. I violated that person's trust in a profound way, used their words without permission because I was desperate for connection. When they confronted me, I had to choose between continuing to perform or accepting that I'd rather be alone than keep pretending. Wyatt turned back to the judge. I chose honesty, chose to stop attending functions I despised, fulfilling obligations that felt hollow, maintaining relationships built on nothing real. That's not insanity, it's exhaustion. Exhaustion doesn't excuse abandoning civic duty, Garrett interjected. No, but it explains it. Wyatt's gaze was steady. I'm not unfit to manage my property. I'm simply unwilling to sacrifice my sanity for other people's comfort. If that makes me unsuitable for polite society, so be it. But it doesn't make me incompetent. The judge was quiet. Then, does anyone wish to speak in support of Mr. Callahan's character? Lydia's father stood. I do, Your Honor. Everyone turned. Garrett looked surprised. Her mother looked alarmed. Lydia felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Reverend Marin, the judge acknowledged. I've known Mr. Callahan for 2 months. In that time, I've observed a man struggling not with mental instability, but with the weight of expectations he never agreed to carry. Her father's voice was measured. He lost his father and gained an empire. Society told him to be grateful, but gratitude doesn't erase grief. Success doesn't eliminate loneliness. And choosing to step back from obligations that exacerbate those struggles isn't insanity, it's self-preservation. With respect, Reverend, you've known him only 2 months, Garrett said. We've observed concerning patterns for years. Concerning to whom? To Mr. Callahan, who's suffering? Or to community members who've lost access to his resources and influence? Her father met Garrett's eyes. I preach about grace and understanding, about seeing people as fully human rather than reducing them to their utility. If Mr. Callahan is guilty of anything, it's of being honest about his limitations. That's not a failure of character, it's an achievement. The hearing lasted another hour, More testimony, more argument, more scrutiny of Wyatt's every choice and withdrawal. Through it all, he sat quietly, accepting the judgment without defending himself further. When the judge finally called for recess to make his determination, Lydia followed Wyatt outside. He stood on the meeting hall steps, staring at the mountains in the distance. "Thank you," he said without turning around, "for what your father said." He meant it. "I know. That makes it more valuable." Wyatt finally looked at her. "You found my letter." "I left one too." "I know. I read it." His expression was raw. "You said you're not afraid of who I am." "I'm not." "You should be. I'm a disaster, Lydia. I violated your trust. I'm facing a competency hearing. I can't maintain basic social relationships without wanting to set everything on fire." "I know all of that. And you're still here." "Yes." He moved closer, still maintaining careful distance. Why? Lydia thought about her letters, about honesty sent into silence, about the desperate loneliness that made people do terrible things, thought about Wyatt reading her words and understanding instead of judging, about seeing her strangeness and calling it brave. "Because you're the first person who ever made me feel like being difficult was worth something," she said quietly. "Because even angry, even hurt, I'd rather have complicated truth with you than easy lies with anyone else." "That's—" His voice broke. "Lydia, I don't deserve that." "Probably not, but I'm offering anyway." They stood there on the steps while the town waited for judgment. Wyatt reached out slowly, giving her time to move away. When she didn't, his hand found hers. The touch was gentle, tentative, nothing like the confident ranch owner or the man who'd read her private words. Just Wyatt, flawed and exhausted and terribly honest. "If the judge rules against me," he said, "Garrett gets everything, the ranch, the land, all of it. Then we'll fight it." "We?" Lydia squeezed his hand. "I told you, I see exactly who you are, and I'm not afraid." The judge's ruling came an hour later. The room fell silent as he read from prepared notes about mental competency, civic obligation, and the standards required to manage significant territorial interests. Then he looked at Wyatt and said, "I find no evidence of mental instability. Mr. Callahan's withdrawal from social obligations reflects personal preference, not incompetence. The petition is denied." Garrett's face went white. Pritchard began arguing immediately, but the judge was already standing, the ruling final. Wyatt sat very still, like he couldn't quite process victory. Lydia watched relief and exhaustion war across his face, watched him realize he'd won not by performing, but by being ruthlessly honest about his limitations. Outside, after the crowd dispersed and the congratulations faded, Wyatt turned to Lydia with an expression she'd never seen before. "I need to show you something," he said, "at the ranch. Will you come?" She should have refused, should have insisted on more time, more distance, more resolution of the hurt between them. Instead, she said, "Yes." Because honesty required following through, even when the destination was uncertain. Because she'd spent her whole life being careful, and it had gotten her nowhere worth being. Because Wyatt Callahan had read her soul without permission, and somehow that violation had become the most honest relationship she'd ever had. And because love, real love, wasn't about perfect people making perfect choices. It was about broken people choosing truth over performance, even when truth was terrifying, especially then. They rode to the ranch in silence that felt less awkward than companionable, Lydia seated in front of Wyatt on his horse because propriety had stopped mattering somewhere between the hearing and this moment. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting everything gold and amber, and Lydia found herself leaning back slightly into Wyatt's chest without thinking. He didn't pull away. His arm tightened around her waist just enough to keep her steady as they climbed the rise toward his house. "I need to tell you something before we arrive," he said quietly, his voice vibrating against her back. "About why I really withdrew from everything. I thought you explained that at the hearing." "I explained part of it, the safe part." He paused. "The truth is harder." Lydia waited, watching the landscape roll past. Finally, Wyatt continued. "When my father died, he left me a letter, private, not part of the will or any legal document, just thoughts he wanted me to have." His breath was uneven. He told me he was proud of the business we'd built, proud of my work ethic and dedication. And then he wrote that he hoped someday I'd find what he never had, someone who saw past the ranch and the money to the person underneath, someone who made pretending unnecessary. The admission hung between them. Lydia felt the weight of it, the loneliness embedded in every word. He spent 40 years building an empire, Wyatt went on, and died alone in a house full of employees and business associates, and not a single person who actually knew him. I watched that happen. Promised myself I wouldn't repeat it. Then spent 3 years doing exactly that, building walls, maintaining distance, performing competence while dying inside. Until the letters, Lydia said softly. Until the letters. Until you. He pulled the horse to a stop just outside the barn. I read your words and thought, here's someone who understands. Who knows what it's like to be surrounded by people and still be completely isolated? And I was so desperate for that connection that I convinced myself the deception didn't matter because the understanding was real. He dismounted first, then helped her down. His hands lingered on her waist for a moment before he stepped back, re-establishing distance. Come inside, he said. Please. The house looked different in the evening light, softer somehow, less fortress and more home. Wyatt led her through the main rooms to his study, the same space where he'd conducted business during their family's dinner visit. But now he walked to a cabinet in the corner and pulled out a wooden box. These are yours, he said, opening it. Inside were her letters, all of them. Not just the bundle he'd tried to return, but every single letter she'd written since February. They were organized by date, each one carefully preserved. Lydia's hands trembled as she reached for the top one. You kept them all. I know I said I'd give them back, but I couldn't. He stopped, started again. They're the most honest words anyone's ever spoken to me. Even knowing I had no right to them, I couldn't let them go. She pulled out a letter from March, recognized her own handwriting describing the Iowa luncheon and 16 women arguing about pie crust. Remembered writing it in fury and loneliness, believing no one would ever read her frustration. You memorized them, she said suddenly, looking up. That first conversation we had, when you quoted my words about performance and pretense, you weren't guessing. You'd read them so many times you knew them by heart. Wyatt didn't deny it. Yes. How many times did you read each one? I don't know. Dozens, probably. Every letter became... He struggled for words. A reminder that honest people existed. That someone out there refused to accept loneliness as permanent condition. Lydia set down the letter carefully. I'm still angry you stole these. I know. But I also understand why you couldn't let them go. She reached into the box and pulled out more letters, reading fragments of her own thoughts. The observation about ruins surviving because they refused to bend. The question about what to do when life fit like borrowed shoes. The confession that writing to silence felt safer than risking real connection. I sound so sad, she murmured. You sound brave, Wyatt corrected. Every single letter is someone refusing to give up on honesty, even when it would be easier to pretend. Is that what you saw? Bravery? That's all I saw. He moved closer, still not touching. Lydia, I need you to understand something. When I fell in love with your words, I wasn't falling in love with sadness or loneliness. I was falling in love with someone who looked at isolation and decided to document it instead of surrender to it. Someone who kept choosing truth even when truth was brutal. And when you met me? Was I what you expected? No? The word was immediate. You were better, sharper and funnier and more complicated than letters could capture. Every conversation we had made me realize the words were just the beginning, that the actual person was infinitely more interesting than anything she could write. Lydia felt tears pressing behind her eyes. You should have told me, right away, the first time we talked. I know, but I was terrified you'd stop being honest, that knowing I'd read your private thoughts would make you perform for me the way you performed for everyone else. He finally reached out, brushing tears from her cheek with his thumb. I was selfish. I wanted to keep the honesty, even if it meant building everything on a lie. Do you know what the worst part is? Lydia asked, her voice breaking. It worked. Even before I knew, you made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. You understood things I'd only written to a dead soldier, And I fell in love with that understanding before I knew it was based on stolen words. Wyatt went very still. You... what? I fell in love with you. She said it clearly, needing him to hear it. Somewhere between the first conversation and the dinner party and standing on that fence line talking about performance, I fell in love with someone who made loneliness feel less permanent. Even knowing what I did, especially knowing what you did. She stepped closer, closing the distance he'd maintained. Because it means you saw all the difficult parts, the parts I usually hide, and wanted more instead of less. That's, her voice caught, that's what I've wanted my whole life. Someone brave enough to see me completely and not run away. I violated your trust, he said roughly. Stole your privacy. How can you... Because I understand desperation. Lydia took his face in her hands, making him look at her. Because I've been so lonely, I've made terrible choices too. Because forgiveness isn't about excusing what you did. It's about choosing to believe people can be broken and beloved simultaneously. I don't deserve that. None of us deserve the grace we're given. We just have to be brave enough to accept it. Wyatt's hands came up to cover hers, his eyes searching her face like he was looking for evidence of deception. If we do this, if we try to build something real, it has to be on truth, complete truth. No more stolen words or hidden things. Agreed. And you have to tell me when you're angry, when I've hurt you, when the violation feels too big to forgive. His voice was urgent. Because I will hurt you again. Not intentionally, but because I'm terrible at this and I'll make mistakes. And I need to know you won't just swallow it and pretend to be fine. I won't. I promise. She moved closer still until they were nearly touching. But you have to promise the same thing. No more withdrawing when things get difficult. No more choosing isolation over confrontation. That's going to be hard. I know. We're both going to be terrible at this. She smiled through her tears. But at least we'll be terrible, honestly. Wyatt laughed, actually laughed, the sound raw and surprised. Then he was pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her like he'd been waiting months for permission to hold her. I love you, he said into her hair. I've loved you since that letter in May where you wrote about the ruins being your confessional. I loved you before I met you, and I loved you more after, and I love you now even though I don't deserve to. Stop saying that. Lydia pulled back enough to meet his eyes. You deserve to be loved. You deserve to be seen. You just had to stop hiding long enough to let it happen. He kissed her then, gentle at first, tentative, like he was still asking permission. But when Lydia kissed him back, pouring months of loneliness and anger and desperate hope into the contact, he responded with intensity that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wyatt pressed his forehead to hers. I need to do something, he said. Something that should have happened months ago. He released her and walked back to the cabinet, pulling out pen and paper, sat at his desk, and began writing while Lydia watched in confusion. After several minutes, he folded the page and held it out to her. Read this. Lydia took it with shaking hands. Dear Lydia, I'm writing to you the way I should have from the beginning, as myself, not as a fiction. As Wyatt Callahan, rancher and terrible human being who fell in love with your honesty before he had permission to. You asked Corporal Ward what he did when life fit like borrowed shoes. Here's my answer. I stopped trying to make the shoes fit and started walking barefoot. It's uncomfortable. The ground is rough. But at least I can feel where I'm going. You wrote about ruins that survive by refusing to bend. You were right. But you missed something important. Those ruins also survive by being witnessed, by having someone visit them and say, you matter exactly as you are. You've been my witness. The person who saw my isolation and didn't try to fix it, just acknowledged it as real. And now I want to be yours. I want to hear about your days and your frustrations, and every difficult thought you've been told to keep quiet. I want to argue about Emerson and walk the prairie and build something real in this impossible territory. I want to love you honestly, the way you deserve to be loved, not despite your strangeness, but because of it. Because you refuse to perform happiness you don't feel or pretend isolation doesn't hurt. This isn't a proposal. Not yet. You need time to forgive me, and I need time to prove I can be trusted with the honesty you've given me. But it's a promise. I see you. All of you. and I'm not going anywhere. Yours in finally reciprocated correspondence, Wyatt. Lydia read it twice, tears streaming down her face. Then she set it carefully on the desk beside her other letters. That's the first letter I've ever received, she said quietly. In all these months of writing, no one ever wrote back, until now. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm not. She wiped her eyes. It was worth waiting for. They stood there in his study while the sun set outside, the room filling with shadows and gold light. Wyatt pulled her close again, and Lydia let herself be held by someone who knew exactly how lonely she'd been and loved her anyway. What happens now? She asked against his chest. Now we figure out how to be honest together. In public, not just private. He paused. Your family is going to have opinions. My family always has opinions. And the town will talk. Let them. Lydia pulled back to look at him. I've spent 26 years trying to fit into spaces too small for me. I'm done shrinking. Wyatt's smile was slow and genuine, the first truly unguarded expression she'd seen from him. Then let's not shrink. Let's take up exactly as much space as we need. The next morning, Lydia woke early and walked to the rock formation one final time. She brought paper and pen, intending to write something, a conclusion, maybe, or an acknowledgement of endings and beginnings. Instead, she found Wyatt already there, sitting on her usual stone. Couldn't sleep, he explained when she climbed up beside him. Me either. They sat watching the sun rise over the prairie, turning the grass gold and the mountains purple. After a while, Wyatt pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. I wrote something last night. After you left. He handed it to her. You don't have to read it now if... Lydia unfolded it immediately. I used to think loneliness was permanent, a condition inherited with my father's empire. Then I read your words and realized loneliness is just fear given too much space, fear of being known, of being too much, of loving wrong. You taught me that honesty is scarier than isolation, but infinitely more valuable. That being seen completely is worth the risk of rejection. That two people can be broken in compatible ways. I don't know what our future looks like, but I know it will be honest, difficult and messy and real. And I would rather have complicated truth with you than easy lies with anyone else. Thank you for being brave enough to write to a dead soldier. Thank you for being braver still to forgive the living man who read those words without permission. Thank you for seeing me. Lydia folded the letter carefully. You're going to keep writing to me, aren't you? If you'll let me. Only if I can write back. I'd like that. Wyatt took her hand. Real correspondence, both sides talking. Novel concept. She laughed despite the tears on her face. Very novel. They sat there as morning turned to day, two people who'd found each other through stolen words and desperate loneliness, learning how to be honest in daylight. Finally, Wyatt stood and pulled Lydia to her feet. I need to tell you something else. Something I should have said last night. What? Thomas Garrett isn't finished. He lost the hearing, but men like him don't give up easily. He'll look for other ways to undermine me, to take what's mine. Let him try. Lydia, I'm serious. I know what he could do. I also know you survived 3 years of rebuilding your father's empire while everyone waited for you to fail. You survived isolation and grief and a competency hearing designed to destroy you. She squeezed his hand. You'll survive whatever Garrett throws at you, and this time you won't be doing it alone. Something shifted in Wyatt's expression, vulnerability mixed with hope. You're sure about this? About us? I'm sure that I love you. I'm sure that loving you is complicated and difficult and probably the bravest thing I'll ever do. She pulled him closer. I'm sure that I'd rather fight beside you than be comfortable anywhere else. Even if it means dealing with town gossip and your mother's disapproval and people who'll say we're both too strange to make this work. Especially then. Wyatt kissed her like she was the answer to every question he'd been too afraid to ask. When they finally broke apart, he was smiling, really smiling, the kind that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. My foreman is going to be insufferable about this, he said. He's been telling me for months I needed to actually talk to people. He sounds wise. He's a pain in the ass, but yes, wise. They rode back to town together, Lydia seated in front of Wyatt again, but this time holding his hand where anyone could see. Let people talk. Let them speculate. Honesty meant being visible, and visible meant vulnerable, but vulnerability with the right person felt like freedom instead of exposure. Her mother was waiting at the parsonage, her expression tight with disapproval. Margaret stood behind her looking worried. Her father was conspicuously absent. Lydia, her mother said carefully, people are talking. I imagine they are. They're saying you were seen leaving town yesterday with Mr. Callahan, that you didn't return until late, that this morning you were seen riding together in a manner that suggests... She couldn't finish the sentence. Suggests what? Lydia asked calmly. Intimacy. Impropriety. The kind of behavior that ruins reputations. Good thing I've never cared much about my reputation. Her mother's face flushed. Lydia, this isn't a joke. Mr. Callahan may have won his hearing, but he's difficult, isolated. Not the kind of man who makes a good husband. You're right. He's difficult and isolated and terrible at social interactions. Lydia met her mother's eyes. He's also the only person who's ever made me feel like being difficult was worth something. So yes, we're together. And yes, that will scandalize people. And no, I don't care. You should care. You have a family to think about. A father whose position in this community. We'll be fine, her father said, appearing in the doorway. Sarah, let her be. Her mother turned. Robert, you can't possibly approve of this. I approve of my daughter choosing honesty over convenience. I approve of her finding someone who sees her value. He looked at Lydia with something that might have been pride. I approve of her being brave enough to build a life that fits instead of shrinking to fit a life someone else designed. But the scandal? There is no scandal, just two people choosing each other despite everyone's opinions. Her father's voice was firm. If that troubles the community can examine its priorities. Lydia felt tears press behind her eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just be happy. That's all I've ever wanted for you. Margaret stepped forward, surprising everyone. I think it's romantic. Margaret, their mother started. No, truly. Mr. Callahan is strange and Lydia is strange, and they found each other in this impossible territory. That's not scandalous, it's... She smiled. It's rather beautiful, actually. Their mother looked between her daughters and husband, clearly outnumbered. Finally, she sighed. If you're determined to do this, at least do it properly. Courtship, engagement, a wedding that demonstrates respect for propriety, even if you care nothing for convention. We can do that, Lydia agreed, and Mr. Callahan will need to demonstrate better social engagement. He can't simply withdraw from the community if he intends to. He won't withdraw, Lydia interrupted. But he also won't pretend to enjoy things he despises. That's the bargain. Honesty instead of performance. Her mother looked like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Finally, she nodded. Then I suppose I should meet him properly. Invite him to dinner as your... She struggled with the word. Your intended. His name is Wyatt, Lydia said softly, and he'd appreciate that. The weeks that followed were strange and difficult and somehow easier than anything Lydia had experienced before. Wyatt came to dinner twice a week, enduring her mother's scrutiny with patience Lydia hadn't known he possessed. He made efforts at social engagement, attending church, participating in community meetings, hosting the delayed governor's visit with Lydia at his side. But he also drew clear boundaries. No, he wouldn't attend every town social. Yes, he'd fulfill civic obligations, but on his own terms. And he refused, absolutely refused, to pretend he valued relationships built on convenience rather than genuine connection. Thomas Garrett watched it all with barely concealed fury. He tried once more to undermine Wyatt's standing, spreading rumors about instability and questions about the sudden courtship. But after the hearing, people were less willing to listen. And when Lydia appeared publicly at Wyatt's side, clear-eyed and happy, the gossip died for lack of evidence. He's going to keep trying, Wyatt said one evening as they walked the prairie together. Let him. Every attempt makes him look more desperate. You're remarkably unconcerned about a man who could still cause us significant trouble. I'm remarkably confident in us, Lydia corrected. Garrett's power comes from appearance and influence. Ours comes from actually being willing to tell the truth. I'll take truth over appearance any day. Wyatt pulled her closer, this casual intimacy still new enough to feel miraculous. I don't deserve you. We've discussed this. Stop saying that. I mean it, though. You could have chosen safety with Garrett or any number of conventional men. Instead, you chose, he gestured at himself, this disaster. I chose honesty. You just happened to come with it. He laughed. The sound easier now than it had been months ago. They'd been practicing laughter together, practicing ease, practicing the difficult work of being known without armor. In September, Wyatt asked her father for permission to propose. Her father gave it with the condition that they wait until spring to marry, allowing time for proper preparation and for Lydia to be certain. I'm already certain, she told her father. Then waiting won't hurt. The proposal came in October at the rock formation where they'd had their first honest conversation. Wyatt had brought her letters, all of them, tied with new string. I'm giving these back, he said. Really giving them back this time. They're yours, and you should decide what happens to them. Lydia took the bundle carefully. What do you think I should do with them? I think you should keep them, as evidence that you survived loneliness by documenting it, as reminder that honesty matters even when no one's listening. Someone was listening, though. You were listening. I was stealing, he corrected. There's a difference. There is. But the stealing led here, to you asking me. She waited. Wyatt dropped to one knee on the rough prairie ground. Lydia Marin, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me that's honest and difficult and probably completely unsuitable for polite society? Yes, to all of it. He stood and pulled her close, kissing her with the kind of intensity that came from months of careful distance finally giving way to permission. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia was laughing. What? Wyatt asked. I'm just thinking about how I got here. Writing letters to a dead soldier because I was too lonely to function. And somehow that led to... She gestured between them. This. I'm grateful to Corporal Ward, Wyatt said seriously, for dying in a way that redirected your letters to me. That's probably terrible to say. It's honest. I'll allow it. They sat together on the stones as afternoon turned to evening, reading through letters that had started as one-sided confession and become the foundation for something real. I want to keep writing to you, Lydia said eventually. Even when we're married and living together, I want to write letters you'll actually receive. I want that too. We can leave them for each other. Truth in writing when speaking gets too difficult. You think we'll have times when speaking is too difficult? I know we will. We're both disasters, remember? He kissed her temple. But at least we'll be disasters who communicate. The wedding happened in April, a small ceremony that scandalized half the town and delighted the other half. Margaret stood as Lydia's attendant, having developed surprising affection for Wyatt once she realized he made her sister happy. Lydia's father performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Her mother attended but refused to pretend enthusiasm for a union she still considered questionable. Give her time, Lydia's father said. She'll come around. She won't, Lydia replied cheerfully, but that's fine. I don't need her approval to be happy. The reception was held at Wyatt's ranch, now their ranch, and drew a smaller crowd than traditional weddings. But the people who came were ones who actually mattered. Her family, Wyatt's foreman and key employees, a handful of genuine friends they'd collected. Thomas Garrett didn't attend, which everyone considered a blessing. That evening, after the guests left, Lydia and Wyatt stood on the porch watching the sunset over land that stretched farther than she could see. This is ours now, Wyatt said quietly. All of it. 15,000 acres of honesty. That's a lot of honesty. We'll grow into it. Lydia leaned into him, feeling the solidity of his presence. I used to think marriage meant shrinking, becoming smaller to fit someone else's expectations. What do you think now? I think it means having space to be exactly as large as we are, together. He turned to look at her, and his expression was everything she'd wanted her entire life. Someone seeing her completely and choosing to stay. I love you, he said, not despite your strangeness, because of it. I love you too, not despite your disasters, because they match mine. They stood there as darkness fell, two people who'd found each other through stolen words and desperate loneliness, learning that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let yourself be known. Years later, when people asked how they'd met, Lydia would smile and say they'd connected through letters, which was true, if incomplete. She didn't mention that the letters were meant for someone else, that Wyatt had read them without permission, that their entire relationship had been built on violation that became understanding. Some truths were private, meant only for the people living them. But sometimes, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Lydia would pull out those old letters and read them again. Would remember the woman who'd written them, lonely and angry, and determined to document her isolation rather than surrender to it. Would feel grateful that somewhere in Montana, a broken man had read those words and seen not weakness, but courage. Had loved her before meeting her, then loved her more after. Had been brave enough to confess his deception and broken enough to understand why she forgave him. The ranch house stopped being a fortress and became a home, filled with books and arguments and the particular comfort of being known completely. Wyatt learned to navigate social obligations without losing himself. Lydia learned that being seen didn't mean being vulnerable to attack. Together they built something that looked nothing like traditional marriage and everything like truth. And on their anniversary each year, Wyatt would leave a letter for Lydia somewhere on the property, hidden in books or tucked under stones or left on her desk. Letters that said in different ways, "I see you, I know you, I love you exactly as you are." Lydia would read them and write back, continuing the correspondence that had started with deception and transformed into the most honest relationship either of them had ever known. Because love, real love, wasn't about perfect people making perfect choices. It was about broken people choosing truth over performance, honesty over comfort, connection over isolation. It was about being brave enough to write your loneliness into words and finding someone brave enough to read them. It was about stolen letters becoming sacred text, about silence becoming conversation, about two people who'd spent their lives invisible finally being seen and staying